Philip, if you can put the first slide up. Thank you. These are the words that have been in my head my whole life that my grandfather told me that his mother told him. I fear I will never see you again. They're words that have rung in my head my whole life. My grandfather, you can go to the next one. My grandfather, my papa, was born in Berlin, Germany in 1920. His name was Martin Dorfman, but I know him as Papa. This is a picture of my grandpapa and I at my bat mitzvah in 1985 in Plano, Texas. And he was very, very important to me, a very huge part of my life growing up, he and my Nana, because I grew up right around the corner, right a few 30 minutes away from them in Dallas, and we spent a lot of time every weekend with them growing up, and as many families are very lucky to have grandparents that they grow up with, he taught me many things about life, but the one thing that he did not, sorry, I see somebody showing they couldn't hear you, is that better? He did not tell me many things about the Holocaust. He would not speak to us about it. He would not tell us any of the stories, would not tell us anything about what he experienced. And so what I'm going to tell you about today comes from what I learned from the tapes and that he and my grandmother both made for the Shoah Foundation, for Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation, what I learned from the tapes that he made. He was born in 1920 in Berlin, Germany, and his sister was born in 1922. He was born to his father, Robert, and his mother, Frida, and they were a family of 4 living in Berlin, Germany. They were of modest means. They were a middle-class family, very happy. They were what you would consider maybe modern Orthodox or conservative. They kept a kosher home. They kept Shabbat. They had family that lived around the corner from them, their cousins. He had a very close cousin, Leon, who he was very close to that was his age, and my great aunt Erna had a cousin, Ruth, Leon's sister. They lived around the corner, and they spent all the holidays together celebrating. They went to a non-Jewish school, regular public school like many do, and they lived a very happy childhood from 1920 to about 1933, just like many of us did. And life was normal. His father worked a normal job. His father was, Robert, my great-grandfather, was a decorated veteran of World War I, fought for the for the German army in World War I. And so when Hitler came to power in 1933, my great-grandfather thought that nothing would happen. While it was scary to hear Hitler on the radio, my papa would talk to his father and say, "This is very frightening, what's gonna happen to us?" His father would say, "It's gonna be okay, things are gonna be okay. I'm a veteran, I'm a decorated veteran of World War I, we're gonna be okay. They're not gonna do anything to us, we're Germans, our family's been in Germany for many generations, we're gonna be okay." And at that point, a lot of German Jews, you may or may not know, but a lot of German Jews were actually starting to leave Germany. And if they had the ability to leave, they were trying to get out. But my family stayed, and a lot of families, some did stay. My grandfather continued to have trouble understanding what was happening. He was questioning, but he was only 13, and so it was hard to question the head of the household, his father. And so he asked his father, continuing to question what was going to happen. At one point, his friends started to turn on him in school, and at one point he was kicked out of his school. He was told not to come back to school, and he started to go to work as a furrier. He started to learn the fur trade in Berlin, and he started to learn, maybe he wasn't going to go back to school. He wasn't sure what was going to happen. The future was unclear, but they still weren't sure if they were able to find a way out. And they started to discuss what was going to happen. They weren't sure how to get out. At that point, it might be too late. And they still didn't know what was going to happen. So in 1937, the Gestapo, when my grandfather was 17, the Gestapo started coming around looking for his father, for Robert, my great-grandfather. And so my grandfather, Papa, would go with his father out to hide from the Gestapo, and that's when they knew things had gotten bad, and things were just getting worse and worse. So they started trying to find a way for their children to hopefully get away out of Berlin at that point. And most of the German Jews, like I said, were trying to leave if they could. And so there was a thing that you may have heard of before, which is the Kindertransport. So there was a Kindertransport, and it was only for children. It was not for adults. A train that was able to leave Germany and take him to London. So my papa got a ticket he was able to get a place on the transport with his cousin Leon. But unfortunately, his sister Erna, the one who was just 2 years younger than him, they did not have a place for her on that transport. And he was very reluctant to go on that transport. He didn't want to leave her, and he didn't want to leave his parents, but his parents really pushed him to go. They said, you need to go. We'll come after. We'll send Erna on the next available train, and then we'll come and follow and be with you. And he was very reluctant, but he ended up listening to them. He had to listen to his father. So the day of his departure, he had to say goodbye to his father, Robert, at their house because his father couldn't go to the train station. It was very dangerous for him to go there. And he was afraid that he would be taken into custody. So he said goodbye, a lot of tears at their house that morning, saying goodbye to his father, Robert, at the house. And then his sister Erna and his mother, Frida, went with him to the train station. And it was a very, very sad scene at the train station. He was at the train station saying goodbye. He was very upset. He, most of all, felt like he was the protector of Erna, and he didn't want to say goodbye to her. And he kept saying to her, you're going to come, you're going to follow me, and you're going to come to London and join me. And so he got on the train. He was about to get on the train with Leon, and that's when I'm going to play the next clip.
My mother somehow had a feeling that she was very glad that I got the papers, but at the same time she was very, very unhappy about me leaving. And when we had to say goodbye, she had, of course, she was very upset and tears in her eyes. She came to the train station. And somehow she must have had a feeling, because her last words to me were, "Son, I have a feeling that I will never see you again." And that has been living with me, the words that she said all my life. And I think it'd be living with me and be in my mind somehow embedded until the day that I'm not going to be around anymore.
So Papa got on the train. Papa got on the train with Leon, and he said it was a very quiet ride. They didn't interact with other people on the train. They just quietly took the transport and eventually made their way to London. And the one thing his father did tell him is he had a very rich uncle that lived in London that when they got there would help them. So they went to the rich uncle's house, Papa and Leon. They went to the uncle's house and they knocked on the door, and the uncle's servant came to the door, housekeeper or something, and said, "Sorry, come back, it's Shabbos. Come back after Shabbos." So these are two 17-year-old boys on their own. So they came back after Shabbos and knocked on the door again. And this housekeeper came to the door again and said, "I'm sorry, he says he can't help you. He's done everything he can for too many people." So they were on their own, living in London, 17 years old, no family, and didn't know what to do. And so he started to figure out how to survive on his own in London at 17 years old. And so he found his way to a furrier that he could start working for, since he had some knowledge of the fur trade. And he started working as a furrier and figured out a way to get money for food and place to live, and started figuring out a way to survive in London as an orphan, basically living in London. His cousin Leon ended up finding some other family that on his other side that he went to live with in another town, and he was surviving. And then one day, a couple years later, he's on the streets of London. And apparently at the time in London, there was fear that the Germans were going to invade Britain at that time. And so there was a lot of Germans coming into London. And so the British were starting to round up any Germans that they would find on the streets. And so they would stop him, and they were stopping Germans that they would see he'd stop on the streets and ask for their identification. So they stopped him one day. He's walking down the street, and they asked for his identification. But he didn't have a British identification, and he really wasn't a citizen of Germany anymore. He'd been kicked out of his country. And so he tried to explain, I'm a German Jew, I'm not a Nazi, because they were trying to find Nazis that had fled Germany. And they took him into custody. And they basically took him as a prisoner of war. And he was trying to explain away that he was a German Jew, not a German Nazi. And they put him on a boat with other Germans that they believed to be Nazis. And they sent him on a ship to Ottawa, Canada. And on this ship to Ottawa, Canada, he described that probably about 90% of the people on the ship were Nazis, former Nazis, and about 10% were German Jews. And at first, these Nazis, former Nazis, or Nazis, thought that they had, at that point, that the Germans had won the war. So they were singing Nazi songs and they were celebrating, even though they were on this ship being shipped off to Canada. And he said it was so upsetting, and here he was, a German Jew, and not knowing what was going to happen to him, but he didn't want to get beaten up, and he probably would be killed because he was only 10% of them were Jewish, so they kind of segregated themselves off. And finally, once they arrived in Ottawa, they were able to convince the authorities that they were actually Jewish. It took 2.5 months for them to be sent back to London. And so for 2.5 months, he was it was like an internment camp in Ottawa, and then they were able to be sent back finally to London. So when he arrived back in London, he decided that he wanted to do something to finally fight back, and he decided to join the British Army. He had such good knowledge of Germany, and he had the German language, and so he decided to join the army. He decided to finally join. You can put that slide back up, actually. So in the slide that he just put up, my grandfather joined the army, and I love this picture because he had a dog by his side. And anyone who knew my papa knew that he loved dogs. Usually he always had a German Shepherd by his side. And so this was him when he first joined the army. And he decided that he wanted to go and fight on behalf of the Jewish people and against the Germans. So he enlisted and decided that he was going to finally take back what was his power. And so he enlisted, and he was able to go with the British Army. He, in 1944, landed on the shores of Normandy 8 days after the invasion, after D-Day. And eventually in 45, he ended up in Hamburg, and he worked undercover for several years, capturing war criminals. And he told several stories about how they would work undercover, since he spoke such good German. He would work undercover, and they would talk to people, and they would know, this guy over here is a Nazi, but he's claiming he's not, so they would get them to admit they were, but they didn't want to get them to admit it too soon until they could arrest them. And it was very hard work, but it was very fulfilling for him, and it was very meaningful work for him because he felt like he could finally do something to bring back some of his own self-confidence and very cathartic work for him working undercover. But he did take it a little too far, like you've probably seen in movies. He was court-martialed twice because he probably was a little too aggressive with some of the people that he captured. And a lot of them were, he was rough with some of them. But that was okay. We forgive him for doing that. We understand. And one of the hardest things for him was that he found out while he was there, he had lost touch with his family. In the very beginning, when he first moved to London, he had been able to get a few letters from them, but he discovered once he was there in Hamburg, he learned that his family had all died. His mother and his father and sister had all died in the camps. And so that was the hardest part for him, was finding out that they had died. And he was there on the second day after Bergen-Belsen was liberated. I'll leave that up very quickly. That's a hard slide to see. But Bergen-Belsen was liberated, and on the second day, he was there after the liberation. And he said that was one thing that he could never get out of his mind. He had nightmares about it, especially because he had just found out that his family had been taken to Auschwitz. And so that was very difficult for him to be there. And the interesting thing to me was that hearing that on his tape, my husband, Brian, who many of you know, his grandmother was liberated at Bergen-Belsen. And we did not realize that my grandfather and his grandmother were at Bergen-Belsen at the same time, that his grandmother was liberated basically by my grandfather from the British Army. We didn't realize that until just last year when I watched these tapes in depth. But that was very difficult for him, and we just, that was a big part of his process. So after he finished his service, he decided to go back to London, and he had met this woman who became my Nana. He met her right before he enlisted in the Army, and her name was Hannah Spiesman, but when they got married, she changed her name to Anne when they moved to the United States, which I'll get to. And so it's hard to call her Hannah, but that was a picture of them when they first met. And they decided, they got married in London, and they decided to reach out to some family in New York. So my Nana was also from Berlin, Germany. She was an only child. Her story is a little different than his. She was an only child, and her father had a shoe store, and they were wealthy, and his store was destroyed in Kristallnacht, and right after his store was destroyed, they moved to London. Her father had been taken into the woods and beaten by the Nazis every night, and after their store was destroyed and they moved to London, he actually passed away because of all the beatings he had taken from the Nazis. And so she and her mother were alone in London, and after she married my grandfather, my Nana and Papa decided they were gonna just pick up and leave London and move to New York, and they were able to get sponsored by my Papa's cousins in New York. So they moved to New York, and then my Nana was pregnant with my mom on the way to New York. You can leave this up for a minute, Philip. And so my Nana was pregnant with my mom on the boat on the way from London to New York, and my Papa said it was the best boat ride of his life because she was nauseous from the boat ride, so he got to eat her portion of the food on the boat. And this is a picture of on the left is my Papa, then is my father, my mom in the middle, my Nana, and then on the far right is my Uncle Mark, who was born in New York after they arrived also. And my mom and my Uncle Mark were both born in New York, and then they eventually moved to Dallas because my grandfather was in the fur business in New York, and his friends said, hey, in Texas, they need furriers. And so he moved to Dallas, Texas to become a furrier. I guess back then, before global warming, lots of people wore fur coats. And so he moved to Texas, brought his family down to Dallas, Texas when my mom was 12 years old, and they started their lives in Dallas, Texas, and he eventually left the fur business and went into commercial picture framing and was very successful, which is amazing because he didn't even have a high school education. He left high school before he could even finish high school. So he was very successful, and he was very involved and philanthropic in both the non-Jewish and the Jewish community in Dallas. This is how I remember my grandparents most of my life. My grandparents were the original founders of the Dallas Holocaust Museum. If any of you had ever been to it, it was this little place in the basement of the JCC in Dallas, and I remember going as a child. It was very small, but they were one of the founders of the museum, and they had a small family. I mean, it was a very small family. It was just the two of them because he was an orphan and she was an only child, and that was all they had. So they had 2 children, and they had 6 grandchildren, and the biggest thing in their life was their family, and they raised their family in Dallas, and it was a source of pride for them was their family, and we grew up and had a wonderful life in Dallas. You can go to the next slide, Philip. Sorry. So this is my mom and my grandfather, and my grandfather, who was kicked out of his country, was so proud. He was very proud, obviously, of both his children, but my mother, who's here with me today, was a state senator in Texas for 20 years. And so for my grandfather, who was kicked out of his own country, to then watch one generation later his own daughter become the highest ranking Jewish official in the state of Texas for 20 years was a very big source of pride for him. And it meant in his mind that he had succeeded, because that was a very big marker of success for him. And so I know that brought a big source of pride for him. And obviously he was also extremely proud of my Uncle Mark. And my mom and dad had 3 kids, and my Uncle Mark had 3 kids, and now they have 13 grandchildren, great-grandchildren, sorry, that's the next slide. I don't have a clicker, so I'm having to indicate to him when to click it. Philip, will you go to the next one? Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, skipped a slide. One of two of his great-grandchildren have been to Auschwitz, and this is a picture of my son, Ari, when he was at Auschwitz, and he found the names of my great-grandparents and my great-aunt in the books in Auschwitz. And then this summer, when I was on the trip that we did, a Beth Shuren trip to Germany and Poland, I also was able to be there for the first time and experience this experience, which was very moving to me. I had a very hard time when I first landed in Germany. Some of you may have been on the receiving end of my phone calls when I was crying because I was very emotional, just arriving in a country that basically kicked out my grandparents and destroyed my family, and being there for the first time was very emotional, but it was a very full circle moment for me. And especially this year, I just learned how to tell his story and how to speak about my family, and it was very emotional for me and very powerful to be able to go back to where it all began. And I really am grateful to Beth Shuren that we had the opportunity to take that trip with such a wonderful group that we were able to take it with. And most importantly was how, for us, is the sense that of family that he and my Nana were able to give us, even though they started from such a small family. This is a picture of 12 of their 13 great-grandchildren that they created out of such a small beginning, of the two of them, and then 2 children, 6 grandchildren, and now they have 13 great-grandchildren with more, hopefully, God willing, on the way. And the last thing that I want to talk about is just that he left a message to me, which I believe speaks to me and to my siblings and my children, is one of the last things that I want to one of the last things I want to share with you.
Would be your single message to your grandchildren?
My single message to my grandchildren would be that they'll never forget where they come from, that they never forget where their grandparents come from, and that they will always remember to be there when help is needed to educate other people about Judaism. And only that way can it be prevented that such a catastrophe will never take place again.
So when I saw that, I thought he's speaking directly to me. This tape was made in 1996, and obviously he didn't know what was coming in the world, unfortunately. And I'm very thankful that they're not here today to see. I think it would destroy them if they knew what was going on. And so when I saw that, I knew that I had a duty and an obligation to continue to spread the message that we can't forget what happened, and that we can't forget that it can happen again. We have to stand up for ourselves and for the Jewish people, and to share the story. And so I've become part of the Holocaust Museum's Speakers Bureau. I've spoken at a Mormon church to 200 teenagers. I've spoken to several other times to Jewish groups. I'm going to be speaking to Kehila High soon, and I look forward to speaking many times in the future to Jewish groups and to non-Jewish groups, hopefully all over the city and more. And I encourage anyone else who's a 3rd generation or 2nd generation survivor, I'm happy to help you get involved as well, because it's a message that we all need to continue to share. All of our grandparents' stories are unique, and they need to be shared with everyone that's willing to listen. And the last thing I want to leave with you is a quote that I saw last summer when we were in Israel at Hostage Square. It says, "Our wounds are centuries old, but so are our resilience and our strength." So I want to end it on a positive note. And it spoke to me because my grandparents were strong and resilient, and that's what made my mother and my uncle resilient and strong, and I believe that's what's made my family the same way. And I wish everybody a Happy New Year. Thank you for listening.